Welcome. I'm Patrick Heffernan from Technology Business Research, and I'm joined by my colleague Boz Hristov, who's a principal analyst and has been working on our digital transformation portfolio for a few years now. He also leads our research around a bunch of the different companies we cover in the IT services sector and the consulting space. And today we're going to talk about a semi-annual report that he just published called Our Voice of the Customer. So within the digital transformation space, we go out, Boz goes out, and talks to a lot of the people who are buyers, the people who are buying IT services and consulting from companies like Accenture, Deloitte, PwC, DXC, all those kinds of companies across the IT services and consulting spectrum. And he talks to them about why are they buying particular services from particular companies. He talks about the trends that are emerging within digital transformation, and he talks about what's coming next. So what we want to do is have this conversation and get from him what are the most important things that are in this report? Because it's a really long report, is it not? Yeah. So let's start off first with what surprised you most. You've been doing this report now for a few years. This is probably the 7th or 8th edition of the Voice of the Customer. So is there something this year right now that jumped out at you and said, well, I haven't heard that before, that was surprising?
Yeah, I mean, maybe before we go into what surprised me, I think it's important to understand who we're also talking to in terms of like the buyers we target. And obviously, as you mentioned, these are buyers that engage many of the vendors we cover. But those are buyers that have been in the business for a while. They have that purchasing power and the view of the market as well. It's important, like from across industries, from logistics through life sciences, large automobile manufacturers, as well as distribution, electrical distribution, CAO, and so forth. So across various industries, there's some common trends that really helping us shape the understanding of the market. And what surprised me really from this iteration was the reality that those buyers have woken up to, essentially. And the sentiment around the expectation around IT, specifically cloud. For years, we know the promise of cloud has been lowering technical debt, lowering the IT bills, shifting from CapEx to OpEx. And that's still true. That's still the case. But the reality of the bills are much higher. That's what the buyers are waking up to. And they have come up to understand that just because that one has shifted to cloud and has adopted cloud as a business model, as an IT model to run their operations, is not going to be just gravy. And really that shift from CapEx to OpEx will be just impacting their bottom line. Actually, it's impacting their bottom line in a negative way. It's actually pressuring them because the costs have come up much higher. And it's that delineation between consumption and subscription. So there's a lot of work that needs to get done by the vendors to make the distinction of what it all means for the buyer. So really the biggest thing is understanding of the value of cloud and understanding, it's not just about IT modernization, but there's so much more that can come with it, and that requires a different approach from the vendors.
So let's come back to the vendors part in a minute, but I want to go back to the buyers for a second.
Yeah.
If they're being pressured and if they're spending more on cloud than they thought they were going to or going to have to, what is that doing to IT budgets as a whole?
Yeah.
Are they going down? Are they going up? Or are they staying flat?
Yeah, so budget. There's two camps when it comes to the budgets from the buyer perspective. One camp is buyers that have set their budgets prior to maybe September 2022. So they're kind of like on the back end of their fiscal year, and they have set their budgets and they're not changing them. Basically, they're executing on their strategy and so forth. So those are the buyers that the budget was set before the interest rates started being hiked up, before everybody started talking about potential recession and so on and so forth. And the other camp of buyers are the ones that are really looking to come more on an ad hoc basis and trying to assess where their priorities are. What does that mean to moving forward, and how to really change the dynamics of their spend. So overall, there's a steady spend, I would say, a steady to increasing spend, broadly speaking. But there's some cautious optimism around where the money to be spent on what initiatives. We're talking to buyers that, there's like, just giving us a good example of like where maybe there was a $100 dedicated to a budget. Now they're about $90 dedicated. There's still money spent on, but it's a moment of like, how do you spend those $90 as they look into the next phase of their budget in the next fiscal year and so forth.
And so then who they spend that budget with, who they spend those dollars with, is going to be at least partly influenced by previous relationships, by contracts they already have in place. It's easier to stick with who you're working with and who you know. But what are the things that you saw, or what did buyers tell you would make a difference when they're out trying to evaluate an IT services vendor? Is it being able to explain how cloud is actually going to do more for them than they expect? Is it being able to do innovation? Is it what is it that motivates a buyer to go out and select a new vendor in the IT services space?
Yeah, so existing relationships are still kind of like an important factor, but as buyers go through their renewal cycles and they continue to open up opportunities and seek what else is out there from a vendor perspective, from capability, from pricing, trying to better understand, so it kind of keeps everyone on their toes essentially. I think the biggest piece of the puzzle as those buyers are looking into the future is vendors' ability to bring in specialization. That's one thing, where it's like the mainstream migration services that from cloud are table stakes, and there's very little to no differentiation. Everyone does it, everyone is doing it. They become increasingly commoditized, so it's very hard for vendors to differentiate on that, even though they may have been the incumbents for a while on those services. What is valuable for the buyers themselves right now is how well those large vendors think about the ecosystem, how they can bring in the depth of specialization, and how they can do they have the same amount of depth as the breadth that they usually tout. And often buyers don't perceive that's an equal balance. So that's when the value of the niche providers come into play. That's when it's really important to include and think about those niche specialized vendors. And there's also a threat in that particular moment to the existing incumbents, especially for someone like the value-added resellers, the VARs, right? There's an opening there when it comes to the renewal times and thinking about, we mentioned the buyers open up RFPs and RFIs for getting new vendors maybe get on the list. But often VARs are the one that actually have a little bit more the ear and the visibility into the renewal pricing contract rates that the technology vendors are charging and whatnot. So they may start to think about a little bit more strategically about presenting them with a better, it's called FinOps scenario, where how well do you optimize your cloud spend? How well are you able to extract the most value out of it? And so there's an opportunity for new contenders to enter the space, which puts some more pressure on the vendors as they think about being agile from pricing. But the specialization it's something that it's increasingly becoming more and more of a tipping the scale in favor of.
So that implies, and maybe I have this wrong, but that you're sort of suggesting that there's more work that the buyers have to do with respect to evaluating, managing, doing contracts with a wider range of IT services vendors. So have we moved away from the one throat to choke, or is there still a role for somebody to sort of are buyers still looking for someone to manage their ecosystem?
Yeah. Yes and no, in a way. What I mean by yes and no is depending on the scale of the opportunity. So there are scenarios, and that came through the conversations we had for this round of the research, where if it's a small opportunity, if it's in the range of like up to $5 million transformation deal, more like a plain vanilla kind of services, this is where buyers will lean over their partners and say, well, you guys can, you have enough bodies, the work is pretty straightforward, it's on you to manage your, ecosystem. When it becomes a larger opportunity, 5 million and above, and going to the hundreds of millions of dollars transformation deals, those become more and more complex, right? And it's opportunity where a lot of the budgets are coming from the different business unit leads. And this is where every business unit leads hold that budget very tight to their chest, and they don't want just to say, oh, here, and I trust my business unit counterpart, and we're going to work and we're going to hire McKinsey because corporate tells us, we have to hire McKinsey to run our relationship. They have their relationships with their vendors, right? So there is that push and pull internal politics relationship that has to be overcome. So it's much harder for a larger transformation deal to be a kind of a one hand to shake, one throat to choke establishment. With that being said, we heard from the buyers, there's probably, I would say that's like the third scenario here in that case. there's actually a recognition that some of those relationships are already occurring, where there's like a multi-party relationships and multifaceted relationships between some of technology vendors, where like SAP and Microsoft are working much better than maybe SAP and AWS, for example, right?
right,
Although
right.
not, they would work with each other, but there's a better
Right.
commercial agreement, quoting
Right.
some of the buyers we heard, between those parties. And then there's the Capgemini and Accenture being partnering with SAP and Microsoft in that cluster here from operation management and execution standpoint. And then there's the BCG and McKinsey maybe doing the corporate. So there's a clusters of like two-dimensional relationships that are more favorable, so to speak, even for those larger transformations. So it's more of a thinking about stitching them together. But the stitching them together requires so much more internal trust between and footprint from the vendor side to bring in those business units together. That's why smaller deals, they're a little bit more, just a plain vanilla account services. They are easier to do through that vendor management and GC approach than the larger BU-led budget initiatives.
Right. Okay. I want to go back to cloud for a minute. You said cloud adoption is accelerated during the pandemic, but now we're into a little bit of a hangover based on how much more cloud costs than people thought it should.
Yeah.
I know you've reported before on sort of the blockchain winter when that hype has kind of come and gone. If you can take it from two different perspectives, Boz, give me what the buyers say are the most important technologies that they're going to need to invest in for their digital transformations, and then give me where are the vendors investing their dollars in expanding or perfecting their portfolios, and are those two things lined up?
Yeah, there's certainly, no announcement today goes without saying about GenAI. I know. We have to put that on the table right up front. But before there's actual ROI from GenAI, I think there's a much greater need and buyers' recognition for a greater cybersecurity. So there's a technology that one would say, well, cyber, everybody knows about cyber. Yes, but there's actually so much. Cyber will increasingly become the stitching, the threat essentially stitching, the threat stitching, all these existing and new technologies to make sure they work. And not just because GenAI will require new levels of security, but think about connecting the physical and the digital worlds, thinking about operations technology, which is another area we start increasingly hearing more and more of OT and IT surprisingly starting to come together. I think it's still a long way to go, but there's an opportunity there for thinking and not forgetting the physical world. As much as buyers have been focused on the digital world and investing in digital, they are recognizing that we should not forget about, and vendors should not forget about the actual physical world and how we interact in the physical world. So OT, IT, cyber becomes really that technology that's really connecting. And obviously GenAI is, there is always a lot of hype, no doubt about it. Buyers recognize that. I have some quotes I can cite in a moment around what it all means to the buyers from a GenAI perspective and implication when it comes to the vendors' portfolios. But that's something that it's everybody's looking into the low-hanging fruit around productivity and obviously getting into what's next from the business model. Maybe I can read you a quote on that last part. So coming directly from one of the buyers. Actually, it's a CIO from one of the electrical distribution companies we spoke to. So the quote goes as such: I think the business consulting companies, they don't have anything to worry about GenAI because they focus a lot more on the business outcome, the business value, the new business models, new commercial opportunities, new ways of thinking about companies' operating model, and so on, because they have a technology component to it. AI, I don't think is going to capture that. Let me put it that way. AI has many, many years to go before it comes close to a transactional element of the managed services. The tickets, the data fixes, doing configuration changes, infrastructure provisioning, a lot of that is going to become more and more commoditized. And AI will have a much bigger play in that area. Think about the cloud today. Before cloud, I used to have 50 people who would provision my environment. I need to stand up a new testing environment. I need to stand up a new QA environment. I need to move environment when you work. And there was an army of team members that I had that's all they did. Now I have a team of 3 cloud engineers who run my cloud operations, and they do all that. So he was given a really good comparison, and that was the threat he was implying to for the managed services. business services, business outcomes, there's always a need for greater thinking, higher value thinking. Managed services becoming transactional, and he drew a very good compare to cloud and how cloud kind of became commoditized, especially with the impact on the staffing pyramid, and thinking about the threat on managed services, especially for the vendors that are really focused, that's their primary business.
And did his comments, were they echoed by others that you spoke to for this?
They sure did, and they were definitely more of that sentiment around, how the evolving nature of one of the directors of a life sciences. It was an IT director of a life sciences company we spoke to. He was like really, kind of like this is a long-term thinking, but they do partner with pretty much all the vendors we cover here, essentially. Not all of them, but many of the vendors we cover, I would say. And that's the big question is like how their relationship will change with those vendors. And I think we're starting to see some of the vendors trying to win as many large outsourcing deals as possible right now so they can secure the base and buy themselves some time before those deals up for renewal, and they rethink how they actually will apply the skills that they have in-house, and do they really need those hundreds of thousands of people to do the same type of work, or they need to rethink the value proposition moving forward.
Right, lock in the contracts now as GenAI starts to
start to impact your traditional application services models.
Two last questions. One, if you had to say these are the 2 or 3 most important takeaways from everything that you saw in this voice of the customer research, what would those 2 or 3 things be?
I brought up one. There's a differentiation through specialization. That's a huge thing. I think the major implication there puts on the vendor pressure is around knowledge management. We talk about all the time in our research, and the feedback we keep hearing, and we heard it as well this time around from the buyers around, don't bring your teams to, and don't use my project as a training ground, right? We heard conversation after conversation again and again where buyers are like, I don't want the vendors to bring their teams to my project, use my project as a training ground of their teams, and then they turn over and they go somewhere else, right? So consistency and knowledge management will be key when it comes to differentiating through specialization, and knowledge management is the foundation of that layer, obviously including the niche providers along the way, certainly a key component there. The other piece that I mentioned is the value of the ecosystem, which again falls into that piece, and understanding when to partner, how to partner with who, obviously for the small deals versus the large deals. This is a lot about accountability and governance of those relationships. That require a lot more alignment of the sales and the delivery models of those organizations that decide to partner differently moving forward. So buyers do see the value of the ecosystem. They do appreciate the separation of labor, obviously, but it's a moment of like, what next can you bring in terms of the higher value services? And obviously, there's always even in a downturn economy, even in a times when, the market is kind of like, okay, everybody's trying to adjust and adapt to what's coming next, essentially. It's still a positive outlook. And I, brought up the OT, operational technology, and GenAI are good technologies to and obviously cyber, that buyers are not opposed to investing in new areas, despite everything that's going on. What's going to really matter is for the vendors to really make sure they're not just charging for the sake of charging buyers for cloud consumption, but actually find the value and bring out the outcomes along the way.
Okay, last question. It's not going to be fair, but I have to ask. Based on everything you've said about generative AI, cloud, and the cost of cloud, cyber, managed services, all the pressures that are coming on a macro level, based on everything you heard from all of these interviews for this voice of the customer research, which IT services vendors and consultancies are best positioned to do well, and who do you think is really going to struggle?
Well, it's again, I'll fall back on the whole ecosystem play, right? So it's the vendors that know what they're good at, know what they go stay within their own streamline. Kind of like we always fall back to that, but this is true because especially in times when everybody's trying to evolve and trying something new, and everybody's just trying to throw spaghetti, at the wall and try to stick with GenAI in their press releases. You can't just try and go on the GenAI bandwagon because everybody else is, right? You need to really try to be strategic around and find the use cases through your partner ecosystem. That's something that it's really standing out, and it's about messaging that and messaging along with your partners and have that cohesive alignment of field sales to the C-suite. Basically, everyone has to be aligned, and that goes bottom up and top down initiative. So this is something that, obviously we just spoke a moment ago. There's some threats and to the incumbents in the managed services space, but there's also opportunities for new contenders like the VARs when it comes to openings and the renewal rate times and so forth. So there's some pockets of thinking more strategically around, especially in downturn, in the short term, when everybody's looking for renewal rates and best cost and all that stuff. So I wouldn't say there's a particular vendor that is best positioned, but it's about grouping of vendors, how they think about their surroundings and what's their portfolio looks like. And think about when they talk about end-to-end, is it depth versus scale? Obviously, the large vendors have the scale, but the depth may comes from somebody else that they need to partner better with.
Let me ask you one quick follow-up, because you said something I think is super important. I want to make sure I understand it right. Yeah. The ecosystem, the alignment around the ecosystem needs to be from the C-suite all the way down to the sales and the field technicians. Mm-hmm. So you're saying that any vendor's ecosystem strategy has to be fully understood within the entire organization, yes?
Very much so, yes. And look, salespeople have their quotas. They will sell what they can sell best. But if you want to have a strategic opportunity and really move the needle, from a go-to-market perspective, you want to make sure your salespeople know what they're selling for that strategic partnership. And if you just maybe you have to make sure that portfolio gets a little bit more optimized. I think that's the big thing, because we didn't say in the beginning, but it's going to probably wrap it up with is digital transformation is pivoting to digital optimization. Yep. And that's really the bottom line. Essentially, everybody's trying to optimize their technology stack. Everybody's trying to, from the buyer perspective, and buyers are looking to optimize and consolidate the vendors that they work with. So if your field sales are aligned well and optimized to what the buyers are looking for through your partner ecosystems, I think it's a winning formula.
That's fantastic, Boz. Thank you very much. And so this research comes out twice a year. So coming in the fall, we'll have a chat again. We'll sit down and go through what the new findings show us, and reach out to Technology Business Research so you can get a hold of this. Thanks.
Thank you.